Welcome to Haggie Reads For You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, Haggie, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi everyone, it's Colleen. Several months ago, I started reading Nancy's book, The 9/11 Crusade. I had read Cosmic Reality. It's in the archives. But I am going to start with the 9/11 Crusade. It's a pretty good story. Preface. For 9 years, I have followed the debate regarding certain aspects of the U.S. government's official explanation for what happened on 9/11/2001. What is distressing is the complete lack of coverage by U.S. media of this debate. The result is the vast majority of Americans are unaware there are blatant problems with the 9/11 Commission report. The purpose of this novel is to provide an alternative explanation of what transpired on that horrific day. The novel is based upon both sides of the debate. It is hoped the book will be successful in opening the discussion to a much wider audience. The 9/11 events themselves resulted in a massive transformation of our society that is continuing. Those changes may be based upon false information. It is our responsibility as American citizens to individually seek the truth, no matter how difficult that truth may be to understand and to accept. This book is dedicated to those researchers who saw the problems and strove to identify fact from fiction. At the end of the novel are 7 pages of notes of references. It is nowhere a complete listing. Day 1, New York, New York. There are certain events so intense, everyone can remember where they were when they found out about it. For most of the world, September 11, 2001 was one of those events. For Americans, 9/11 took on added proportions. Most Americans became aware of the event as it was happening. The first airliner struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. By 9:03, a huge television audience witnessed the attack on the South Tower as it happened. By 9:59, the vast majority of Americans were watching television when the South Tower erupted into a massive debris cloud. Nellie Morris was one of those Americans who saw it all on television. Most Americans believe the United States government's explanation that the attack planes had set fires so intense that they melted steel and caused the towers to collapse. With an explanation firmly in mind, most Americans moved on, but Nellie Morris could not move on. During the 12 months since 9/11, Nellie had been rather obsessed with the event. Nellie did not believe the official explanation. She wanted to believe, but Nellie feared her father and his identical twin brother had been responsible for installing a controlled demolition system in the Twin Towers. Nellie believed that system was what took down the towers. Nellie's uncle had committed suicide within days of the attack. Her father had left shortly after that on a road trip, taking him away for almost a year. During that year, Nellie studied every article, every report, every book she could find focusing on 9/11. She kept hoping to find some factual basis to dissuade her from her fears. What she found only strengthened those fears. The first anniversary of 9/11 had just passed. Nellie was still in her New York condominium, not far from the World Trade Center. Since graduating from the prestigious Barnard College in the city, Nellie and her best friend Shelley had built a business creating websites. They were successful enough that their shared New York apartment had been replaced by 3 side-by-side condominiums. Each woman had her own apartment, and the third was their office. It was late afternoon, and Nellie was nervously awaiting her father Sid's visit. During the past year, they had infrequently spoken on the phone. On those few occasions, Nellie did not know what to say to her dad. She never mentioned 9/11, and neither did he. Knowing her 12-month search for the truth was almost over, Nellie sat in the comfortable easy chair, worrying. She was 33 years old, and Sid was still her father, and she his only child. And while they had always shared an amazingly close and loving relationship, Nellie was well aware of how relationships can change drastically. Nellie briefly considered just letting it all go. What happened, happened. But Nellie needed to know the truth. The only one who could provide that was her dad. Nellie had sat in the easy chair to face the computer monitor across the room. On the screen was a photograph of the Twin Towers burning. Her intent was to have her dad sit in the chair and see the images. Nellie had no intention of delaying the inevitable confrontation. She believed introducing the image of the towers would be the least confrontational way of beginning. Nellie knew she was carrying a lot of anger. The image was doing to Nellie what she hoped it would do to her dad. Nellie was remembering the details of that most horrifying day. It was a clear sky, that fall morning of September 11, 2001. They would call it a brilliant day. As Nellie was preparing to go to work, the television kept her company with Good Morning America. It was more like listening to than watching the morning TV show. And it was approaching 9 a.m., and Charlie Gibson and Diane Sawyer were scheduled to sign off when the commercial ended. Nellie was walking by the television and glanced at the image of a burning building. At first she hardly noticed. Then Nellie realized it was one of the Twin Towers dominating New York City and standing as an icon for the Big Apple. Charlie and Diane replaced the scene of the burning tower on the television screen. The ABC newscasters began discussing what they were hearing in their earpieces. A fire had broken out in one of the Twin Towers. Then they also saw the burning tower as the TV audience again had their television taken over with a strange image. While Nellie had been sleeping, a plane from Portland, Maine, arrived at Boston's Logan Airport. 2 disembarking passengers were Mohammed Atta and Abdulaziz Alamari. As Nellie's alarm went off at 7:50, the 2 Middle Eastern men were on board American Airline Flight 11, which was pushing away from the gate. The Boeing 767 carried over 10,000 gallons of jet fuel for its trip to the opposite coast of the United States, Los Angeles International Airport. The pilot of AA-11 was John Oganowski, a Massachusetts native who had flown with the U.S. Air Force during Vietnam. Oganowski was an activist on behalf of local farming and was married to Margaret, with whom he had 3 daughters, Laura, Caroline, and Mary Catherine. His co-pilot was 42-year-old Tom McGinnis, who had been with his wife Cheryl since she was 16. Together they had Jennifer and Tommy and were living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. 9 others made up the crew on AA-11, which would serve the 81 passengers on board. The flight was 51% capacity. At 7:59, Flight AA-11 took off, 14 minutes late. As the plane was leaving Earth for the last time and flying over Boston Harbor, Nellie hit her snooze alarm a second time. When Nellie sat up in bed ready to start the day, it was 8:13, and Flight AA-11 had been ordered by Boston Air Traffic Control to turn 20 degrees right. Ogonowski radioed his response, 20 right, AA-11. This was the last normal communication from the cockpit. By 8:20, Nellie had brushed her teeth, washed her face, and was pouring water into the filter pitcher. AA-11 was now off course. The airliner's transponder signal had stopped transmitting. AA-11 was no longer sending its identification signal, providing information on location and speed. Ground controllers guiding the flight paths of all aircraft were not able to accurately track the Boston airliner. AA-11 was now a danger to all other aircraft in the area. While Nellie Morris listened to Good Morning America periodically, looking at the television, 45-year-old Betty Ong, a flight attendant on AA-11, called Vanessa Mentor at American Airline reservations from a phone in the back of the plane. Betty had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown as the youngest child of Harry and Yi Gum Ong, who owned a grocery store. Betty had assigned herself to AA-11 to get back to California in time to join her sister for a Hawaiian vacation. On the phone with Mentor, Betty calmly related that 2 fellow flight attendants had been stabbed, and that one was on oxygen, and a passenger had his throat slashed and looked dead. Whoever had hijacked AA-11 were in the cockpit. Ground manager Michael Woodward was talking to Amy Sweeney, another flight attendant on AA-11. Amy had worked for American Airlines for 12 years and normally only flew on weekends. She was on AA-11 because the scheduled attendant had called in sick. Amy and her husband had 2 children and lived in Massachusetts. Manager Woodward heard Amy relate that, in addition to the passengers and the 2 flight attendants, Ogonowski and McGinnis, had also been stabbed. Amy thought mace had been used because there was something in the air affecting their breathing. American Airlines employee Woodward and Sweeney would stay on the phone while Nellie Morris continued getting ready for work. At 8:20, when AA-11 began to go off course, the airliner started veering north of its scheduled flight path. The plane was located between Albany and Lake George, New York, when it suddenly took a 100-degree turn to the south. AA-11 was headed directly toward New York City. For the next 26 minutes, the aircraft flew south above the Hudson River, following the river until the north side of the tower of the World Trade Center was visible. AA-11 flew directly into the center of the glass wall and disappeared forever. The impact came at 8:46:26. The North Tower had been hit between the 94th and 98th floors. AA-11 had been flying an estimated speed of 490 miles per hour when it collided with the tower. A vibration ran through the building into the ground and was intercepted by seismographs at a number of locations. It was equivalent to a magnitude 0.9 earthquake and too small to be felt on the streets of New York. By the time Nellie Morris saw televised images of the burning building, AA-11, with Ogonowski, McGinnis, Ong, Sweeney, and 88 others, had ceased to exist. Nellie was watching with Good Morning America's Charlie and Diane the burning aftermath of its death. That was when Nellie saw a second plane come into view. She thought, dumping water? Just before it seemed to take an abrupt turn, just managing to hit the second tower and erupting into a massive explosion. Diane Sawyer whispered, "Oh my God." Charlie Gibson said nothing. Nellie Morris screamed. She knew she was witnessing the worst day of her 32 years. She also began swearing between negative, "Oh no, oh no, oh no." Nellie had replayed that day in her mind too many times. As she sat in the easy chair in her living room in the New York apartment, looking at the computer screen across the room, Nellie had remembered again. She got up thinking, yep, he'll see the screen. Sooner or later he'll notice the screen. Sid Morris was due within the hour. As planned, Nellie had her father sit in the easy chair across the room from the computer. She took another easy chair facing him with the computer behind her. While they traded hellos and how you doing dialogue, Nellie watched her father's eyes. It did not take long for him to notice the computer screen. He stopped talking and stared at the image of the Twin Towers in flames. At 8:14, United States Flight 175 took off from the same Boston runway AA-11 had used 15 minutes earlier. Sid Morris was in the North Carolina mountains and had been up for hours. He had gone on his morning run, fed the dogs and cats, and put out seed for the wild birds. United 175's pilot, Victor Saracini, his wife Ellen and daughters Kirsten and Brielle, had celebrated his 51st birthday on August 29th. 38-year-old Michael Horrocks was the co-pilot. His children were Christina, Mick, and his wife was Miriam. Horrocks had been a football player and a Marine. The plane they were flying had been built in 1983 and was only carrying 56 passengers and a crew of 9, which was a 33% capacity. 12 minutes after Boeing flight controllers officially listed AA-11 as hijacked, they called United 175 asking the pilots to look for AA-11 about 10 miles to their south. The United pilots confirmed that they could visually see AA-11. They were told to keep away from the airliner. With loss of both transponder and radio communications with AA-11, only a radar blip was showing up on a ground radar screen. The air traffic controllers did not have an accurate altitude or speed. In an area normally stretched to the breaking point with flight controller overload, the controller's primary function was to separate planes in jeopardy. In this case, the plane placed in jeopardy by the hijacked AA-11 was United 175. 4.5 minutes later, at 8:41, pilot Victor Saracini spoke to the New York Air Traffic Control Center, which was now the flight center controlling airspace United 175 had entered. The radio transmission from Saracini reported that during departure from Boston, they had heard a strange transmission, sounding like someone keyed the mic saying, "Everyone stay in your seats." This was United 175's last official transmission. 5 minutes later, United 175's transponder stopped working for about 30 seconds. It was turned on with a new code and then turned off again and on again with yet a third code. Ground radars did not link the new transponder code information with the actual radar track of United 175. This occurred around 8:46, just as the first tower was struck by AA-11. United 175's flight attendant, Robert Fangman, had joined United in January and was the youngest of 7 children and 33 years old. His mother Ruth was looking forward to his planned visit to Texas that had been delayed a day. Robert would manage to get out a call on the airphone to the United Airlines San Francisco office. He would tell Mark Policasto both Saracini and Horrocks were dead and another attendant stabbed. The call would last 75 seconds. United 175 had already flown by New York City and was just west of Newark, New Jersey, when it began deviating from its assigned westward flight path to head south. While making the turn, United 175 climbed 3,000 feet in about 1 minute. Astonishing flight controller Dave Bottiglia, who had never seen an airliner make such a fast rate of climb. Ground controllers repeatedly called United 175 with no response. By 8:55, United 175 was endangering other planes, including 2 Boeing 737 aircraft. Delta 2315, heading southwest at 28,000 feet, turned in response to ground controllers alerting the pilots. But United 175 also turned, and controllers watched the radar blips from the two planes merge into one signal. They actually missed each other by an estimated 200 feet. U.S. Airlines 542 had been following the Delta plane, and its onboard collision alert system sounded an alarm in time for the pilot to descend, avoiding a mid-air collision with United 175. United 175 had been flying southeasternly along the eastern edge of Pennsylvania. As it crossed back into New Jersey airspace, United 175 reversed course, turning back toward New York on a northeasterly heading. It then began descending at 10,000 feet per minute toward the city, again endangering numerous other aircraft. The last radar reading on United 175 showed the plane to be at an altitude of 18,000 feet and descending in a power dive. While Nellie watched a burning tower with Charlie and Diane, her father was washing dishes and generally on a mission to clean up the log cabin. Sid was taking out the garbage at 9:02:54, while Nellie witnessed United 175 fly into view on the television and impact the South Tower between the 78th and 84th floors at a speed of over 500 miles per hour. Sid's phone rang minutes later. Nellie was on the line. "Nell, what a surprise! How are you doing?" Her voice had that coldness that freezes the heart without any verbal warning. "Dad," she was saying, "turn on the television. Both twin towers are burning. They've been hit by a passenger plane, and the United States is under attack." As he walked toward the television with the phone to his ear, Sid felt like he was moving through some weird dream. He said nothing in reply to his daughter's news report. "Dad?" she prompted. Sid found his mouth so dry it reached down into his throat. His ears were ringing as his heart pumped blood faster and faster. Automatic flight or fight signals were racing through his body as his mind began free-falling into panic. "Dad!" "Yeah." He had reached the television and turned it on. It showed the burning towers. "I see. Dad, Uncle Jimmy." Nellie could not vocally finish her thought. She'd already confronted imagined images of what burning infernos were doing to the people inside the buildings. Her father's identical twin brother worked at the World Trade Center. Sid found himself saying, "I'm sure he's okay. Don't worry." Meanwhile, the 52-year-old man's body was going into shock. His knees felt weak and he flopped down in a chair with his eyes glued to the television. Sid was listening to Nellie relate events of her morning, while he also listened to the words coming from the television. Both sets of voices disappeared behind thoughts of his brother. Sid was named for his father's grandfather. Jimmy owed his name to his mother's grandfather. That was almost all that separated them until the age of 27. They had shared what identical twins always share. They were never far apart in anything, including their occupations. Both had gone into the family business. Both were demolition experts. Both had worked within the World Trade Center, setting up the explosive charges throughout the Twin Towers to prevent the worst-case scenario. The World Trade Center actually encompassed a 16-acre site, holding two 110-floor twin towers and 5 other buildings. The complex was constructed and operated by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. 3 World Trade Center was the 22-story Marriott Hotel. 2 9-story office buildings were called 4 and 5 World Trade Center, and 6 World Trade Center was a 8-story U.S. Custom House. 7 World Trade Center was built as a 47-story office building. The North Tower was WTC-1, and the South Tower was WTC-2. The real problem with the World Trade Center, in addition to being a complex of 7 buildings in lower Manhattan, was what surrounded it. In buildings that could be damaged or destroyed by falling tower were crucial United States International and New York City operations. As he continued watching the Twin Towers burning, Sid remembered being on top of the South Tower looking down from its 1,363-foot-high observatory. Sid could see the dome top of the Merrill Lynch building with the North Cove Marina behind it, sheltering tiny little sailboats. The pyramid-topped building housed American Express. From the top of the tower, Sid envisioned 110 floors falling, which he knew could take out surrounding buildings, including both the heart and the mind of Merrill Lynch and the American Express. His brother Jimmy had just verbally painted such a scene and was continuing, "Look over there, Sid," Jimmy said while walking and pointing. "There you have 7 World Trade with the Federal Building on one side and the New York Telephone Building on the other. What would happen if the tower fell in that direction?" From the South Tower's observatory, you could see 45 miles in every direction. Jimmy was standing next to his twin saying, "Look in any direction. What would happen if 200,000 tons of steel and 425,000 cubic yards of concrete crashed to the ground?" The two faces that looked mirrored stared at each other. Jimmy finished, "You gotta help me with this, bro." Realization that terrorists considered the Twin Towers legitimate targets in the war against America came on February 26, 1993. Terrorists in the basement parking garage used a rented van to deliver a 1,500-pound urea nitrate bomb with a timing detonator. The explosion rocked the adjacent commuter train station, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000 others. The tally was $300 million in damages. The towers were repaired, cleaned, and reopened within a month. Life went back to normal as the Twin Towers, but only on the surface. $60 million went into securing the Twin Towers complex from future attacks. Security experts planned for a closed building with complete control over accessing the facilities. Bullet-resistant guard booths, anti-ram barriers, a system for detecting stopped cars, and bomb-sniffing dogs became integral to securing the complex. If something did go wrong, 15 miles of fiber optics were put in to carry security transmissions and emergency power. The best security systems that money could buy were the response to the 1993 attack. Still, if the 1993 bomb had been placed a short distance from its ignition location, it was conceivable that the inconceivable could happen. One or both towers could have tumbled over. That was the worst-case scenario that James Morris was hired to prevent. He was to create a plan that could provide a controlled demolition to take the tower straight to the ground with limited damage to the surrounding buildings. It was 1998, on top of New York City, when Jimmy pleaded, "Sid, I need you to help me plan and implement the demolitions. This needs to be done in absolute secrecy. It would be difficult to rent space to people who knew the buildings had explosives throughout the structures. Just in case. But you know, in this day, the impossible could happen. Anyone with enough money and focus could take the towers down. They need this fail-safe demolition system. I need you to help me give it to them." Sid was brought back from his remembrance. He still had the phone to his ear, and Nellie was saying, "Dad, are you there?" "Yeah, sure. Listen, Jimmy doesn't work in that tower either. I'm sure he's okay. Let me give him a call." Sid hung up moments later. He did not try dialing his brother's office. Sid knew Jimmy would call him if he could. Things had to be in chaos. Sid studied the television images. One World Trade Center, as the TV commentators were calling the North Tower, had been impacted directly in the center of the north wall. Sid thought of the tower as a silo within a silo. This is how they planned to bring it down, just like they would a silo. The smaller inside silo contained over 100 elevators and the stairwells. The outer silo was attached to the inside silo by beams. The beams, or trusses, held floors approximately 1 acre in size. All total, each tower contained 4.8 million gross square feet of floor area and over 300,000 square feet of glass in its 20,000 windows. It was the idea that businesses and leisure visitors, estimated to be 150,000 to 200,000 daily, could be jeopardized if the towers ever fell, that made Sid join his brother. Sid found it ironic the demolition system had been finished only 2 months before. The explosive been secretly put in central critical location points and tied together with miles of fiber optics to a computer located in 7 World Trade Center, or Building 7. The plan called for simultaneous demolition of both the inner and outer silos in sections from the top to the bottom. As he studied the first tower to be hit, Sid thought the interior silo could easily have been breached. The inner silo with the elevators and stairs was the only way out. Sid knew people above the impact point would have no way down. With the amount of smoke pouring from the structure, he suspected most of those above the fire would not survive smoke inhalation. Sid noticed things falling from the upper floors, and tears started rolling out of his eyes. Sid Morris knew the things were probably human beings, making the last choice of their lives, to die by fire or smoke, or a plunge to the ground. Still, he believed the structure could survive. The panels of the outer silo should be all right. The towers had been designed to withstand a direct hit by a large airliner. The south tower was another thing altogether. Sid watched as they showed reruns of the initial impact by United 175. The plane had almost missed the tower altogether. At the last possible instant, United 175 caught the corner of the south tower. Sid knew the other silo had been completely breached. In a worst-case scenario, the structure above the open wound would come down. The top of the tower could start falling toward the weakened corner, eventually sliding and ripping off. The falling floors would likely further damage the lower structure. The television was focused on the north tower, the one first hit. Sid was intently studying the picture when he saw it begin falling, much as he had imagined it would do if the demolition was successful. A fraction of a second later, Sid realized the tower was still standing. He had only imagined its destruction. It was around 9:45 when Sid heard the commentator saying that the Pentagon was under attack. The phone began ringing. It was Nellie. "Daddy, what's happening?" She was screaming. Sid replied, "I don't know, Nell. I'm sorry I can't be there with you. Jimmy's phone's been busy," he lied. "I'm scared, Dad." "So am I," Sid replied while thinking of his daughter's apartment and its proximity to the World Trade Center. He could hear sirens in the background. As he continued staring at the television, he saw the tower falling again, immediately followed by the realization that it was still standing. This time it was the south tower. Over the phone, Sid heard a pounding and muffled voice in the background. Nellie said, "Dad, Shelley's at the door. Let me know if Uncle Jimmy calls." Sid was pulling down the phone when he saw the south tower begin falling again. This time it did not stop. This time it was for real. He found himself not surprised. It fell just as it was supposed to fall, straight down, within 12 seconds. Sid said aloud, "Well done, Jimmy," imagining the pain that his brother must have gone through, agonizing over the decision to have the computer execute the demolition program. Sid Morris began sobbing. He imagined how sensors from all over the South Tower rapidly predicted the nightmare to come. They would have shown destruction in the outer silo immediately. As the fire weakened the structure, additional sensors would have painted an accelerating failure, which would eventually cause the top 27 floors to fall and rip away. The sensor system would have told Jimmy that he had no choice. The South Tower was going to be destroyed, one way or the other. To limit the devastation, Jimmy would have the computer begin a sequence of explosions, which would take the tower down like so many other silos the Morris Demolition Company had orchestrated over its 80 years of existence. Just a day's work. Sid Morris could not stop crying. By 10:29, Sid's eyes and face were red and swollen, but the sobbing and the tears had stopped. He had tried to call Nellie but could not get through. He suspected the telephone system had failed and possibly the electric grid was out. He knew she was safe. The demolition had been textbook perfect. The debris field was minimal. Sid was still in the chair, still staring at the television when he saw a puff of smoke. He recognized it immediately. The only tower standing had just burped white puffs of smoke. The only time you have such a white smoke is when explosives are set off in concrete. "Oh no," he said aloud, and then he watched the North Tower's controlled demolition in a smooth wave through each floor at a uniform rate. Each structural member crumbled to the center and left no remaining skeleton. It was another symmetrical and uniform operation. Like the South Tower before it, the North Tower fell straight down in less than 12 seconds. This time, Sid Morris jumped up and screamed, "Jimmy, what the hell did you do?" Sid's 2 German shepherds, which had been sleeping in the room, immediately jumped up and began running around barking. Sid continued screaming. He was mimicking the aimless running around of the dogs. Sid soon found himself outside, screaming at the forest. Looking skyward, he screamed at whatever god or gods existed. "What the hell have you done?" Sid Morris screamed until he could scream no more. A year later, Nellie watched her father fade into memory of that event. He had seen the computer image and stopped talking. Nellie watched and waited. Sid came back to the present slowly. He took his eyes off the computer monitor to look at his daughter. "Sorry," he said. "What was I saying?" Nellie replied, "Dad, was Uncle Jimmy responsible for the demolition of the towers?" Sid sighed and looked away. His eyes snapped back to focus on the computer screen a room away. "Yes," he said quietly. Nellie continued her interrogation. "And what part did you play?" Sid looked at Nellie, replying, "I helped in the planning and the laying of explosives." While she expected this to be reality, Nellie felt a numbness transcending over her. She put her arms around herself and pulled in a self-embrace. Sid watched his daughter hug herself, and he asked, "When did you suspect?" Nellie looked up, saying, "That first day. Not when it was happening, but soon after. I saw the demolition blast perfectly synchronized. You taking me to so many demolitions as a child taught me what to look for. It was just too damn blatant. 2 perfect 12-second free falls. And knowing you had worked there with Uncle Jimmy made me suspicious that my family of demolition experts had taken down the Twin Towers." "Why, Daddy?" "To protect 200,000 people and the heart of America's financial district." "Is that why Uncle Jimmy killed himself?" "I suppose." Sid slid again into the past, where the sheriff explained about his brother's tragic suicide drive over the cliff. "What really happened?" Nellie probed. "I need a drink," Sid said. "You want something?" "There's beer," Nellie replied. "Good," Sid said, while thinking bourbon would be better. Got up and went to retrieve a couple of beers. Returning, he handed one to Nellie and sat back down. A few minutes went by before Sid began. The South Tower had to go. The top floors were beginning to fall toward the corner, destroyed by the airplane collision. Jimmy's sensors were telling him that. When we placed the charges, we placed sensors. It took 3 years, but you know that. It was the 3 years I spent here in the city. Jimmy engaged the computer program which had already recalculated the sequence of explosions. As the top was falling off, Jimmy had to get it to stand upright before it could fall straight down. The explosives on the 84th floor were set off in a sequence that started on the northwest side. The top floor started to fall, and then the first charges caused it to stand upright. At that moment, detonations on the 75th floor began. It was all there. You were right. It was damned obvious. Sid continued. Explosives in the top floors were detonated almost simultaneously, causing the top of the tower to turn to dust. At the same time, massive underground explosions in the basement, actually at the base of the towers, began taking apart the substructure in a critical series of detonations lasting about 5 seconds. We needed to detach the central support columns from bedrock to drop the towers into the original excavation hole. Nellie interrupted. They know about that. They have seismic evidence from Columbia University that energy equivalent of more than a magnitude Earth 2 earthquake was recorded as each tower began falling, but before any debris hit the ground. Sid was surprised. He had not even considered seismic recordings existed. Stupid of me, he thought. Nellie asked, Did you use many nukes in the basement? Why would you ask that? He questioned. Some have interpreted seismic data to indicate a small nuclear blast occurred. Sid answered, I don't know what happened in the basement. Jimmy only had me working in the upper parts of the towers. During the planning phase, there were a lot of discussions as to what to use at the bottom. They dug a 7-story excavation hole to build the towers. They had to go that deep to reach bedrock. It was a perfect hole to drop the towers into, as the upper explosions took them apart, section by section. Sid's voice trailed off, and he got that far-away look again. He was remembering the 47 huge box columns connected to bedrock that had supported the towers. The steel walls of the columns were 4 inches thick. A moment later he was back. I didn't work on that part of the plan. I don't know what they finally used. Nellie asked, what other than a nuclear blast would result in fires burning for over 100 days? What? They had fires burning for over 3 months? Yes. And they were hot. A NASA plane flew over the rubble and collected infrared data 5 days after the attack. The data showed surface hot spots, hot enough to melt aluminum. Now, aluminum melts at around 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Are you saying that those temperatures on the surface were for 5 days? At least 5 days. No one knows how hot the deeper layers of the rubble pile were. But there was still a good deal of smoke and heat coming out of that rubble into December. And there were numerous reports of molten steel. Sid was incredulous. He had never heard of anything like this in any demolition. Maybe they did use something nuclear. I just don't know. They had mentioned something called a micro-nuke in the planning. I just don't know. Sarah asked, in the discussion, did they have any reservations over radiation? There was some discussion, and whoever the guy was presenting this option assured us that there would be no radiation. Nellie responded with a disgusted voice. And you would believe this? If nukes were used, do you think any of those working in that debris pile were told that nuclear waste could be present? Sid repeated, they assured us there would be no radiation. Nellie realized that she was looking at her father as if he was the stupidest man on the planet. Why are you looking at me like that? He asked. Nellie did not know what to say. She shook her head, replying, Dad, I suddenly feel like I don't know who you are. Sid imagined what this all sounded like. Madness. It sounded like madness and something out of a thriller. He suddenly felt absolutely stupid. He thought, someone would have checked to see if there was any radiation. Surely someone would have checked. Jimmy would have made sure someone checked. Nellie, meanwhile, found her mind racing into total paranoia. Daddy, why did the North Tower have to be destroyed too? I understand the first tower with its falling top, but the North Tower didn't look to be in any danger of collapse. That's the problem. The North Tower was an accident. Nellie repeated, an accident? A computer problem or something. Jimmy didn't know what happened. He was as surprised as anyone when the second tower fell. It wasn't supposed to happen. Sid trailed off, thinking of a distraught twin desperate for the same answers Nellie was now in search of finding. Nellie asked, Uncle Jimmy didn't know why the North Tower fell? Nope. And while he couldn't imagine what had happened, he felt himself to blame. I tried to tell him it couldn't have been his fault. Jimmy did not program the computers. He only told computer experts what and how the explosives had to work to take a tower down in a controlled demolition. He said all the sensors in the North Tower showed it was stable. Then suddenly, the system just engaged itself. Jimmy wasn't to blame. He wasn't to blame. Since 9/11 changed her reality, Nellie Morris had begun listening to everybody. She even listened to the Art Bell radio show with its weird and out-there guests. Her mind was programmed to believe the unbelievable, and she saturated that mind with conversations concerning a variety of conspiracy buffs, including those who believed that 9/11 attacks had been solely designed to have Americans give up their freedoms for the prospect of security. Nellie suddenly found herself very afraid for her father's safety. Dad, do you really believe Uncle Jimmy killed himself? That's what they say happened. Tell me what they said happened. Well, there were witnesses. Jimmy parked his car at a spot on the side of a mountain road, a scenic view thing. He was there for a long time before he started the car, backed up, and simply drove over the cliff. Who are these witnesses? Sid was uncomfortable with thoughts that Nellie's questions were causing. I don't know. Who told you the story? The sheriff. What sheriff? I don't remember his name. He came out to the cabin and he told me. What department was he with? Sid struggled to remember. He realized the insignia on the police cruiser was too small for him to read, and the sheriff was dressed in civilian clothes. The badge was flashed and simply said, Sheriff. The stranger gave him a card bearing information for a funeral parlor where Jimmy's body had been taken. The casket was sealed because the remains were badly burned and broken from the fiery crash at the end of the cliff. Sid Morris realized that he knew very little about his brother's final hours. He did not even know for a fact that Jimmy's body had been in that casket. Sid was again feeling very stupid. I don't remember which department. I don't really know or remember anything, he said with deep remorse. Tell me exactly what happened. Sid related the story ending with, I never saw Jimmy's body. Nobody asked you to identify it? Nope. Did they ask for any DNA sample from you or anything to prove a link to the body? No. They just said he was in the coffin. Wow, Nellie commented, looking with pity on her father. Stupid, huh? He asked. Yes, but more like naive. I love you, Dad, but your imagination is lacking. I don't watch thrillers. I think you may be living one, Nellie said. She got up and went over to her father. She sat in his lap and hugged him and put her face against his neck. They held each other for minutes. Immediately after Jimmy's funeral, Sid left. He turned over the cabin and care of the pets to his ex-wife, Sarah. Sid got into his car and started driving. The trip took him away for a year and into South America before he returned to Nellie's. While he periodically kept in touch with his daughter during the trip, Sid refused to talk about anything relating to the attacks on the Twin Towers. Sid returned after realizing he needed to get back into living. He was only back for a few hours, and the nightmare had begun again. The phone started ringing, and Nellie got up. Sid could hear her muffled conversation on the kitchen phone. When she returned, Nellie said, Dad, let's get something to eat and meet up with Marty. Who's Marty? He has a website up on 9/11, and a while back I sent him an email. He responded and we eventually got together. He travels a great deal, but happens to be in New York with a friend this week. He had an appointment canceled and wants to know if I could meet him for a lunch date. He said he'd love to meet you. Martin was his given name. His family had a weird sense of humor, but Marty did not mind. His name was only another thing that set him apart. He also had an extraordinary mind. Marty was 33 years old, never been married, and had gotten into computers from the very beginning of the information age. As he sat in the back booth of the bar and grill, across from the father-daughter couple, Marty had just heard about the possible nukes at the bottom of the towers. On September 11, 2001, Marty was on a plane returning from a business trip to Arizona. He was reading some technical data at 8:20 while American Airlines 77 took off from Virginia's Dulles Airport for Los Angeles. Marty had lived in Virginia not far from Chantilly, where the airport was built to lighten the load on the Washington airport. He had often watched airliners on their approach to Dulles, his favorite being the supersonic Concorde with its odd nose and unmistakable sound. For Marty, the term 9/11 did not bring images of Twin Towers burning. The first image that came to his mind was the face of his sister, Jill, that would quickly be followed by images of a burning Pentagon, and then red and blue stripes on a silver plane with AA on the tail, the Boeing 757 called AA-77. Jill was a civilian who had worked for the Department of the Army for nearly 20 years. She died in the Pentagon on 9/11, along with 125 others in the building. For Marty, that date marked the beginning of his crusade. AA-77 was piloted by Charles Chick Burlingame III. The next day, Wednesday, September 12th, would have been his 52nd birthday. His father had been with the U.S. Air Force, and Chuck built his first airplane from found lumber when he was 6 years old. The little boy painted USA on it. Burlingame went on to graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy and fly F-4 Phantoms off aircraft carriers. He was currently a captain in the Naval Reserves and had been working for American Airlines since 1979. He was married to Sherry, and their daughter was Wendy. Burlingame had been on active duty during Vietnam and the Persian Gulf War. Flying as Burlingame's first officer was David Charlebois, who was 39. He had been there with his partner Tom for 14 years. Charlebois' dad had been with the U.S. Diplomatic Corps, and his son was born in Morocco and spent his early childhood in Paris. Charlebois had a bachelor degree in aeronautical sciences and was employed with American Airlines since 1991. The Boeing 757 had 4 flight attendants, and 2 of them were not originally scheduled to be on the flight. Michelle Heidenberger accepted the flight to build up vacation time. Michelle was 52 and employed with American Airlines for 27 years. She was married to Tom, a pilot with U.S. Airways, and the mother of Allison and Thomas. Renee May was asked to take the flight the morning of 9/11. 39-year-old Renee had agreed to marry David just the month before. She intended to soon retire from American Airlines after 15 years with the company. Renee was able to contact her parents and during a 2-minute phone call ask them to notify American Airlines that her plane had been hijacked. AA-77 took off 10 minutes late and flew westward on its way to California. 5 minutes after AA-11 crashed into the first tower, Burlingame made his last radio contact. 6 minutes later, he did not respond to a routine call from an Indianapolis flight control. At 8:54, AA-77 was over Ohio and turning toward the southwest. 2 minutes later, Indianapolis control radar lost the transponder signal from Burlingame's aircraft. The Indianapolis controller was not aware of the attacks on New York. He thought AA-77 had a mechanical or electrical failure. He informed others in flight control that he had lost AA-77. They began clearing aircraft traffic away from the designated westward flight path AA-77 had been flying. For 8 minutes, Indianapolis Control lost complete contact with AA-77. In the case of AA-11 and United 175, even after loss of transponder information, controllers could still see the blip on the radar. But in the case of AA-77, even the blip was missing due to a radar system inferior to those in the northeast area. Indianapolis concluded that AA-77 must have crashed, and they notified the Air Force and local police to search for a downed aircraft. They also notified the local Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, of a possible crash. FAA headquarters and the military were not notified. No one at Indianapolis Flight Control noticed an unidentified blip up on their radar flying east. AA-77 had reversed course. That same unidentified blip showed up on radars at Washington Flight Control, and again, it went unnoticed. But at Dulles Flight Control, the radar blip was seen and tracked on its eastward flight path. It was 9:24 a.m. The Federal Aviation Administration Regional Center finally notified its Washington headquarters about problems with AA-77. Indianapolis Control had reported the problem 15 minutes earlier to the regional office. 30 minutes had already gone by since Indianapolis had first lost radar and transponder signals on AA-77. Indianapolis, Washington, and Dulles Flight Control radars had all received an unidentified blip heading east. Jets out of Langley Air Force Base were finally ordered scrambled to protect the Washington area. FAA regulators stipulated an aircraft emergency exists when there is unexpected loss of radar contact and radio communications with any aircraft. This failure of ground control to follow regulations haunted Marty. Calling for a scramble of jet fighter planes to intercept aircraft had averaged 2 per week. Calling the military was not a drastic thing to do, and 2 aircraft had already slammed into the World Trade Center. Marty initially could not imagine what went through the minds of those men who doomed his sister, because they had delayed in calling for jet interceptors for almost half an hour. Marty soon discovered the number of air bases used for fighter plane alerts had dwindled sharply in recent years. By September 2001, there were only 7 sites with interceptors ready to be airborne within 15 minutes. The 2 most obvious terrorist targets were Washington, D.C. and New York City. The fighters scrambled to intercept AA-11, and then United 175, targeting New York, came from Otis Air National Guard Base on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, 153 miles from New York. The fighter sent to intercept AA-77 came from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, 105 miles from Washington. At 9:26, the FAA stopped all takeoffs. All airborne international flights were directed to land in Canada. The Langley jets had been airborne for 6 minutes when AA-77 hit the Pentagon. Jill Martin died at 9:37 at her desk. She'd been dead for 8 minutes when the FAA ordered all domestic planes in the air to land at the nearest airport. A few minutes later, the pilot of Marty's plane returning him from Arizona gave the first indication that something was very, very wrong. The intercom broke the news. "We're going to land in Kansas City. I don't want you to think there's anything wrong with this aircraft. The FAA has ordered all airborne aircraft to land. There appears to have been at least 2 hijacked planes, and there may be more. This is not one of them. We'll let you know what we can." The pilot never said anything more. Marty was slow to learn the full story. He was one of thousands of stranded passengers, straining to see and hear televisions in crowded terminals across the United States and Canada. It was the news that AA-77 had hit the west wall of the Pentagon that sent Marty into panic. As he learned more throughout the morning, Marty silently screamed at himself to remember exactly what Jill had said. She had just moved to a new office because of renovations to the Pentagon. Marty remembered her saying, "I think I'll be retired before they finish the renovation. They've spent 3 years on the west side alone." But which way had she moved? Did Jill move toward the west side and the point of the impact, or had she moved away from the destroyed wall? Marty kept ringing her cell phone, leaving a message, wondering if the phone recording was the last time that he would hear Jill's voice. And finally, his cell phone went dead. Marty did not see Jill Martin's name on the updated list of Pentagon victims until Wednesday afternoon, almost 30 hours after her death. He was devastated. He knew it was not a mistake. Felt it was not a mistake. The New York waitress was setting their orders out. "Yes, that's mine," Marty said. After she left, Marty asked the father and daughter, "Who else knows about this?" Nellie looked at her dad. Sid said, "There are many who know about the upper floor's explosives. There may have been 2 others who knew about the nuclear charges in the basement. That is, those are the ones that I know of. Who else? Anyone who may have been involved with transportation of the charges? Anyone who might have been told about the demolition system? The computer guys?" Only Jimmy knew everyone who was involved. My job was to help with planning and installation. "Who worked with you on the installation?" Marty wrote down the 2 names that Sid had gave him. "You mean only 3 of you actually placed the explosives?" They were real intent to keep it secret. They didn't even want a hint of rumor. We masqueraded as maintenance workers and were told not to talk to anyone while we were working. And that got difficult at times. One guy took to pretending that he was a deaf mute. Sid had to smile thinking of Rodney. Anyway, that's why it took us 3 years. The fiber optics and sensors were actually put into place by a security firm. They didn't understand the full implications of the system. Marty said, "They jumped, you know." Sid responded, "Excuse me?" A helicopter pilot reported that he saw the Twin Tower jump just before it began falling. "That would be the nuke explosives, I suppose?" Marty asked. "Wow. I don't know, maybe," Sid said thoughtfully. Marty was looking intently at Sid when he asked, "How could you convince yourself this planned demolition was a good idea?" Sid was feeling uncomfortable with Marty and not sure if he was being interrogated by a possible friend or someone else. "Do you have a problem with me, Mr. Martin?" Sid asked bluntly. The reaction made Marty sit up straight. "No." "Yes. I guess I do find you rather pathetic." "How so?" Sid said, feeling the hairs on his neck prickling him as they stood up. Marty slumped back in his chair. "I'm sorry. I'm just really tired. Someone planned the whole damn thing. You're a bit player. This is bigger than any of us." Nellie leaned forward toward Marty. "You don't think my dad could be in danger?" "Maybe, but no one really wants to hear what he has to say. It's just an added confusion to an already unbearable event. Let me put it this way. One of my side jobs is to bet on the stock market. I'm called a day trader. So I took a look back at what happened just before September's attacks. What I found was that there were 6 times higher than normal purchases of put options on United Airlines in the 5 days prior to September 11. Seeing the confusion on his companions' faces, Marty explained, "In its simplest terms, a put option is a contract, giving a buyer the option to sell stocks at a future date, at a set price that does not depend on the actual price of the stock. Someone bet that the price of United Airlines stock would fall drastically before the date that would sell back the stock. The United Airlines stock brought this way allowed someone to make a profit of almost $5 million. Marty was energized by the interest and look of surprise emanating from his audience. He continued with more enthusiasm. This happened at the Chicago Board Options Exchange, and United Airlines was the only airline that had such a trading record. except for American Airlines. The same pattern of put options involved American Airlines, although in neither case was there any reason for such trading. And again, someone stood to make $4 to $5 million. Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter and Company, which occupied 22 floors of the World Trade Center, also showed an interesting thing. 3 trading days before 9/11, over 2,000 put options were bought on Morgan Stanley, compared to an average put option buy of 27 per day. That would have made someone $1 to $2 million. Marty continued. And then there was Merrill Lynch, which was next to and below the towers. There were 12,215 put options in the 4 trading days before the attacks, compared to an average of 252 contracts per day. That's like an increase of 1,200%. Someone would have made over $5 million in that trade. Sid was stunned. Who else knows this? It's been reported in a number of pieces, but not gotten the press that it should have. Another real interesting aspect in this report is in the San Francisco Chronicle that came out on September 29th, 2001. They reported that over $2.5 million in trading option profits on United Airlines stock had not been collected. Nellie asked, what does that indicate? Someone who was greedy got scared. Remember, they closed the stock market for 4 days, and a quick in-and-out transaction could not be made. Sid demanded, so what are you saying here? I'm saying this is bigger than the biggest. Within 3 weeks of the tragedy, the Security Exchange Commission was investigating what it called suspicious financial transactions. Nellie interrupted. Well, couldn't that be something the terrorists did? Nell, the scale of trading goes way beyond the work of a handful of Saudi fanatics. Never mind bin Laden's guerrilla band. The Security and Exchange Commission asked U.S. security firms to produce customer records involving put options involving shares in airlines, insurance companies, tourism business, financial companies and corporations with offices in the World Trade Center. These were the same stocks which suffered the worst drops, and particularly hit hard by Wall Street sell-off. The SEC asked foreign government and security exchange organizations for help. They gave out a list of 38 businesses that they're focusing on. Marty paused and chuckled with a smirk before continuing, but get this. The Canadian Investment Dealers Association posted the list to its website, saying the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission was focusing on trading of the 38 stocks between August 27th and September 11th. Someone in the U.S. forced the Canadians to pull the list within days of its posting. And on October 2nd, the Wall Street Journal itself reported the Secret Service was also probing an unusually high volume of 5-year U.S. Treasury note purchases. There was one single trade of $5 billion. The president of the German central bank confirmed suspicious trading, including gold and oil, but he cautioned that there was a major problem in proving it. If you look at the total picture, it looks pretty suspicious. But when you look closer, it gets all muddied up. Sid interrupted this time. So it was a worldwide event? The suspicious trading? Marty took the momentary interruption as an opportunity for some serious eating. The question remained hanging as Marty gulped down a portion of his quickly cooling hamburger. After washing it down with some coffee, Marty replied, Right. The financial leaders of the European Common Market met and ordered 15 nations to take a look at suspicious trading and have their reports in by October 16, 2001. So what did they find out? Nellie asked. Marty'd gone back to eating and just shrugged his shoulders in reply. You don't know? Why? Never heard any more about it, he replied between bites. Sid noted. Maybe it all got taken over by those searching for the terrorists, like, the FBI. Maybe they're not talking about it because they are really looking into it. Marty motioned to the waitress, indicating he needed more coffee. Look, guys, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that you're probably not in any real danger. This conspiracy is massive. There's a whole bunch of people who know even more than you do, Sid. The fact that the buildings came down through a careful demolition is already known. The fact nukes might have been used was already suspected. But the seismograph signature seen at the time of each tower fall, it looked like underground nuclear explosions. Even one of your planet explosives in the North Tower seen prematurely detonating in the French documentary video taken from ground level of the first attack. How's that? Nellie asked for clarification. A couple of French documentary makers were following the daily activities of a New York City fireman. They were in the street filming when the sound of aircraft above made them all look skyward, including the guy who was looking through the camera. So the very first attack is on video. It shows a plume of smoke blowing out the side of the building perpendicular to the crash, like a secondary explosion. It could have been one of your secret explosives accidentally set off by the plane. Others have talked of it in those terms, so again what you have in your head isn't that secret. At that moment the waitress arrived to offer coffee to the three. A few minutes later Marty continued, "So anyway, I think you're probably okay. Just lay low and quiet. It is what it is, and I don't know what any of us can do to stop it." Nellie said with concern, "Marty, you seem really pessimistic. What's happened that got you so down?" she asked. "Remember when I was at your place last month?" "Well, sure." "No, I mean when we got into that conversation about Behold a Pale Horse." Nellie recalled for her father, Behold a Pale Horse is a book written by William Cooper. He got into Navy intelligence and had access to some really spooky stuff, including the plan for a world government. He is now a radio talk show host. Marty said, "Bill Cooper's dead. The Arizona police shot him to death last November." Nellie explained, "What?" "Well, you knew he never hesitated to tell it like it is, and he did not buy into 9/11. Story of terrorists from outside the country. He was making a case on his radio program that the event might have been designed and carried out by those who would have American citizens give up their freedom in the name of security. He may have been the first voice raised in revolt against the official version of 9/11. Anyway, Bill worked so hard for decades to tell America of real dangers, and then they just shot him to death. His book's considered the best-selling underground book of all time, and while only promoted by word of mouth, it's been read by a huge variety of people of all races, religions, and nationalities. It can still be purchased at Amazon.com, and it has to be 30 years old. Cooper lectured all over the country. He did not believe the Oklahoma City bombing went down the way that they said. President Clinton called William Cooper the most dangerous radio host in America. Cooper went on to sue the IRS. He was into radio and publishing, hated the White House, and still he was allowed to live while continuing to claim and provide evidence there were secret organizations really controlling the U.S. And after all this, he starts disputing the official 911 story, and cops go in and shoot him dead not a month later. Sid asked, "Exactly how did he die?" Arizona's Apache County Sheriff's Office claims that they were waiting for him to serve a warrant for aggravated assault and 2 counts of endangerment. Cooper ran into the cops and he was leaving his home in his car, and the cops said Cooper saw him and went back to his house, where he got out of his car and began firing a pistol as he ran away. Marty paused before concluding. Bill Cooper was missing his left leg. How far could he have gotten on a prosthetic leg? One deputy was badly wounded. It just sounds strange. Although William Cooper's website is saying it did not look like anything connected to William's fight with the feds. Nellie commented, "Wow, that does sound, conspiratorial. I remember he said a couple of attempts had already been made on his life. Cars running him off the road and such." Marty responded, "It could simply be a series of coincidental events. Those who knew him said that Cooper was real hard to get along with, and he said if they came for him, he'd make a stand at his home. He'd send his family away in 1999 for their own security. Maybe Cooper just pushed the locals' buttons. I don't know. Okay, guys, I'm going to have to end there, and I'll pick it up again next Wednesday. and this is Nancy L. Hopkins' book. I thank y'all for listening and being in the chat, and I hope you're enjoying this, and I'll see y'all later. Bye now.